They gave me 24 hours to erase my life, my ranch, my livelihood, as if it were a chalk line on concrete. And that threat is exactly why you need to hear what happened next. The notice was taped crookedly to my barn door, flapping in the wind like it was proud of itself. HOA letterhead, red ink, bold words, demolition order. I stood there with dust on my boots and a coffee gone cold in my hand, reading the same sentence again and again, waiting for it to make sense. This land wasn't some pop-up shed in a suburb. It was a working ranch I'd built board by board, legal permits filed, taxes paid, inspections passed, or so I thought. The HOA had formed quietly while I was focused on fencing and livestock. A group of investors bought the neighboring parcels, rebranded the area as a lifestyle community, and suddenly decided my cattle, my fencing, and my weathered barn hurt their aesthetic vision. They claimed my ranch violated new covenants I never signed. Tear it down in 24 hours or face daily fines and forced removal. I laughed at first, the kind of laugh you make when something is so absurd it feels like a prank. Then I saw the deadline. I called the number on the notice. A woman answered, cheerful and cold at the same time, and told me enforcement was non-negotiable. She said, "You had your warning." I asked when that warning was supposed to have happened. She said, "Check your mailbox history." I knew then this wasn't a mistake. It was a play. That night, I sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind my pasture, listening to my animals settle. I could have panicked. I could have begged. Instead, I pulled every deed, survey, and lease I'd ever signed. I spread them across my kitchen table, cross-checking dates, names, easements, and boundaries, noticing patterns I had ignored before. This ranch existed long before the HOA's glossy brochures and promises. What they didn't know was that while they thought they owned the neighborhood, I owned something far more valuable. The ground under their feet, leased, managed, and contractually tied to me in ways they never bothered to investigate. Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof, and I realized fear was exactly what they expected. Instead, I felt calm focus. Every threat creates a countermove. Every deadline reveals leverage. By morning, I wasn't planning to tear anything down. I was planning to return their order with interest, patience, and a very expensive lesson they would never forget about land. Power and contracts they ignored entirely. Morning came fast. The kind of morning where the sky looks too calm for the fight you know is coming. I loaded my truck, not with tools to tear anything down, but with folders, maps, and a recorder. The HOA deadline clock was ticking, but deadlines only matter when you don't understand the rules better than the people threatening you. I drove straight to the county records office, the same place most people never visit because they assume paperwork favors whoever shouts the loudest. It doesn't. It favors whoever reads. The clerk recognized my name before I even sat down. Ranch owners tend to stand out in a sea of suburban filings. She slid over the microfilm index and pointed to a stack I hadn't reviewed in years. That's where I found it. A long-forgotten land use agreement tied to the original subdivision approval. Buried in legal language was a simple truth. Every parcel in that HOA depended on my land for access, utilities routing, and drainage rights. Not ownership, dependence. And that dependence wasn't free. The agreement was written decades ago when the land was still raw. It allowed residential development only if a renewable lease was maintained with the ranch. Owner, me, the lease covered. Water easements, service roads, and runoff channels that protected their properties from flooding. Without it, the HOA technically had no right to operate as a community. The rent clause hadn't been updated in years because no one had challenged it. Until now. I called my attorney from the parking lot. He went quiet as he read the scanned pages I sent. That silence turned into a low whistle. He told me not to respond to the demolition order yet. Instead, he drafted a formal notice of lease review and adjustment. Perfectly legal, perfectly timed. If they wanted enforcement, they'd get it. Just not the kind they expected. By noon, the HOA board was in an emergency session. I know, because one of their junior members called me, voice shaking, asking if there had been some misunderstanding. I told him there was no misunderstanding at all. They wanted to pretend my ranch didn't belong. I was about to remind them how deeply they relied on it. The lease allowed for rent adjustment based on market impact, operational disruption, and administrative interference. Their demolition order checked every box. My attorney calculated the maximum increase allowed, 10 times the current rate, per parcel, retroactive to the notice date. Suddenly, their 24-hour ultimatum wasn't about my barn. It was about their budget collapsing overnight. I finally replied to the HOA with one envelope. Inside was their demolition order, highlighted, attached to my rent adjustment notice. No insults, no threats, just numbers, dates, and signatures. The kind of response that doesn't shout but echoes. The deadline they gave me expired at sunset, And instead of bulldozers rolling onto my land, my phone started ringing. Not angry calls, not confident ones either. These were the sounds of people realizing the ground they stood on wasn't solid anymore. The HOA board tried to hold an emergency meeting that night, but panic has a way of leaking through walls. Messages flew across the neighborhood forums, half-truths mixed with speculation. Someone posted that the ranch owner was blackmailing the community. Another claimed the HOA had already won in court. None of them knew the truth yet. By morning, I received the official response. It was polite, overly wordy, and careful in the way only fear makes people careful. They requested a temporary pause on enforcement actions while they reviewed newly presented documentation. Translation: they had finally read the clause they never knew existed. My attorney advised silence. Let them stew. Let every hour without a response add pressure. Behind the scenes, the numbers were hitting them hard. 10 times the rent wasn't just painful, it was catastrophic. Their budget had been built on predictable, low land access costs. Now, every home depended on a lease that could legally be terminated if unpaid. Utility providers started asking questions. Insurance carriers flagged risk. One missing signature could freeze everything from trash pickup to road maintenance. I drove the perimeter that afternoon, slow and deliberate, watching contractors pause work as rumors spread. A few residents waved. Others stared. I didn't blame them. Most had no idea their HOA had picked a fight using authority it didn't actually have. Authority borrowed, rented, and now very expensive. The HOA president finally requested a face-to-face meeting. Neutral location, mediation tone. I agreed, but on my terms. We met in a county conference room, not their office. They came with binders and forced smiles. I came with one folder. When they argued that my ranch violated community standards, I slid the original land agreement across the table. When they claimed new covenants overrode it, I pointed to the signatures and filing dates. When they threatened legal action, my attorney calmly explained what would happen if the lease was suspended for even 48 hours. Silence filled the room. Not dramatic silence, practical silence. The kind where calculators start clicking in people's heads. Their demolition order quietly disappeared from the conversation. In its place came phrases like mutual benefit and long-term cooperation. I leaned back and told them something simple. They could rescind the order publicly, acknowledge the ranch's protected status, and accept the adjusted rent. Or they could fight, lose access, and explain to hundreds of homeowners why services stopped overnight. I wasn't angry. I was done being underestimated. The HOA didn't answer immediately after that meeting, and that delay told me more than words ever could. When people stop threatening and start calculating, you know leverage has shifted. They scheduled a full community vote, something they rarely did unless absolutely forced. Officially, it was about restructuring agreements. Unofficially, it was about survival. The board needed the homeowners to approve the rent increase, because without it, the lease would default and the entire development would unravel. I was invited to speak, not demanded, invited. That alone was a victory. When I walked into the packed community hall, the mood was tense but curious. These weren't villains. They were families, retirees, people who had bought into a promise that never mentioned dependence on a working ranch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult the HOA. I told them the truth calmly and clearly. I explained how the ranch existed before the development, how the land agreements worked, and how the demolition order had triggered the rent clause. I showed them copies of the filings, the dates, the county stamps. You could feel the room shift as people realized this wasn't a personal feud. It was a legal reality their board had ignored while chasing appearances. Then the HOA president spoke. He tried to frame the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, something that could have been avoided. That's when a homeowner stood up and asked why the board had ordered a legal ranch torn down without consulting anyone. Another asked why the lease had never been disclosed during purchase. The questions kept coming, sharper each time. Control slipped away from the board in real time. The vote took less than 10 minutes. The result was overwhelming. The community approved the adjusted rent, demanded a formal apology be issued, and required the board to enter long-term protection clauses for the ranch. The same authority that had tried to erase my livelihood was now bound to protect it. After the meeting, several residents approached me privately. Some apologized. Some thanked me for standing firm instead of folding. One older man shook my hand and said, "You taught them something tonight." He was right. Power doesn't come from titles or threats. It comes from knowing what you own and refusing to let someone rewrite it. The demolition order was officially withdrawn the next morning. Public notice. Signed and archived. My ranch stood exactly as it had before, only now its position was stronger than ever. The HOA still existed, but it operated carefully, aware that not all land bends to aesthetics and pressure. As I drove back through my gates that evening, the sun low and gold over the pasture, I realized this fight had never really been about buildings. It was about boundaries, respect, and what happens when someone mistakes convenience for control. Life didn't explode after the vote. It settled, and that quiet outcome was the real victory. The HOA sent the first adjusted rent payment within 30 days. Right on schedule, wire transferred with a memo line that simply read, "Land lease compliance, no speeches, no appeals, just acceptance." 10 times the rent meant hard choices for them. Dues went up, budgets tightened, but the ranch stayed, and more importantly, the precedent was set. The board changed after that. 2 members resigned within a month, quietly citing personal reasons. New faces took their seats, people far more interested in cooperation than control. They invited me to future planning meetings, not because they suddenly liked ranch life, but because they finally understood dependence. When you rely on someone else's land, you don't issue ultimatums. You negotiate. The ranch benefited too. The increased rent allowed me to improve fencing, upgrade water systems, and expand operations without loans or outside pressure. I hired locally, which softened attitudes faster than any argument ever could. People saw trucks moving, animals thriving, work being done. The ranch wasn't an eyesore, it was an anchor. Every now and then, I'd hear someone say the HOA lost that fight. They didn't. They learned. And learning is cheaper than ignorance in the long run, even if it feels expensive at first. The real loss would have been bulldozers rolling in because no one bothered to read what they signed. One afternoon, months later, I found the original demolition notice in an old folder. I almost threw it out, but I kept it instead. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Paper cuts both ways. Authority is only real when it's grounded in law, not confidence. I still see HOA emails from time to time. They're careful, now, respectful, full of phrases like coordination and mutual understanding. They never mention tearing anything down again, and they never will. Because once a boundary is defended properly, it rarely needs to be defended twice. Standing on my porch at dusk, watching the same land that started this whole conflict breathe and move and live, I understood something clearly. They tried to erase my ranch in 24 hours. Instead, they funded its future for decades. Not through anger, not through revenge, through patience, preparation, and letting people discover the consequences of overreach on their own. That's the lesson they paid for. Rent due monthly, respect due always, and land, once understood, doesn't forget who truly owns the ground beneath the rules.